U.S.-Mexico border in Brownsville, Texas, this is Democracy Now!
Justice Kennedy's retirement makes the issue of Senate control one of the vital issues of our time, the most important thing we can do.
Supreme Court Justice Anthony Kennedy is retiring. The announcement has sent shockwaves across the country. A Trump justice could transform the Supreme Court for decades. Kennedy has often been a swing vote, siding with liberal justices preserving reproductive rights, affirmative action, and criminal justice reform. Kennedy's decision came on the same day the court dealt a major blow to public sector labor unions. We'll get the latest with Dahlia Lithwick of Slate.com. Then communities in the epicenter of the Trump administration's zero-tolerance crackdown are mobilizing to keep migrant families together.
It doesn't matter our status. All families in the United States have rights, and we have to lift our voices. We are united, speaking out, and we're not alone.
A federal judge has ordered the Trump administration to reunite more than 2,000 migrant children snatched from their parents, but some have already been deported. We'll talk to a Brownsville-based lawyer who says some of her clients have not been allowed to talk to their children after weeks in detention, even with her help. We'll also speak with longtime human rights activist and attorney Jennifer Harbury, who obtained the audio of the separated children in a Border Patrol processing center that has shocked the world. Now, Jennifer Harbury says people who come to the United States seeking asylum are being illegally turned away. Her own husband, Comandante Everardo, was disappeared after he was captured by the U.S.-backed Guatemalan army in the 1980s. She'll tell that story as well. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. We're broadcasting live from Brownsville, Texas, on the U.S.-Mexico border. In a move that could transform the Supreme Court for decades, Justice Anthony Kennedy announced his retirement Wednesday, giving President Trump a chance to pick a second conservative on the high court. Although Kennedy was a Reagan appointee, he was widely seen as the swing vote on the 9-justice court. His retirement gives President Trump the opportunity to cement a conservative majority for a generation. This is Trump speaking at a campaign-style rally Wednesday night in Fargo, North Dakota.
We have to pick a great one. We have to pick one that's going to be there for 40 years, 45 years. We need intellect. We need so many things to go. You know, there's so many elements go into the making of a great justice of the Supreme Court. You got to hit every one of them.
Senate Democrats lack enough votes to block Trump's nominee, but are pushing for the confirmation process to occur after the midterm elections, just over 4 months away. Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell has rejected that idea, even though in 2016 he refused to hold hearings in election year for then-President Barack Obama's Supreme Court nominee Merrick Garland.
I have every confidence in Chairman Grassley's conduct of the upcoming confirmation process in the Judiciary Committee. It's imperative that the President's nominee be considered fairly and not subjected to personal attacks.
Justice Kennedy's announcement came as the Supreme Court struck a major blow to organized labor Wednesday in a 5-4 ruling written by Justice Samuel Alito. The court sided with Mark Janus, a child support specialist who argued a state law in Illinois allowing unions to charge a fee for collective bargaining violated his First Amendment rights. The ruling nullifies so-called fair share provisions and will leave public sector unions deprived of millions of dollars in union dues. Mark Janus was supported by a host of right-wing groups, including the Koch brothers, Americans for Prosperity, and ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council. In a statement, the American Federation of State, County, Municipal Employees, AFSCME, wrote, quote, "It's shameful that the billionaire CEOs and corporate special interests behind this case have succeeded in manipulating the highest court in the land to do their bidding. This case was nothing more than a blatant political attack to further rig our economy and democracy against everyday Americans in favor of the wealthy and powerful," unquote. We'll have more on Justice Kennedy's retirement and the Janus decision after headlines. On Capitol Hill, House lawmakers Wednesday rejected a Republican anti-immigrant bill that would have provided a path to citizenship for young undocumented immigrants in exchange for President Trump's hardline immigration policies, including $25 billion to further militarize the U.S.-Mexico border. The bill failed on a vote of 121 to 301 after more than 100 Republicans joined Democrats to reject the legislation. Meanwhile, protests against Trump's immigration policies continue to rage across the country. In Washington, D.C., police set up metal barricades around the headquarters of ICE, that's Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ahead of a protest Wednesday by scores of activists who chanted, "Quit your jobs." Similar protests organized under the hashtag Occupy ICE continue to play out in San Diego, Philadelphia, Detroit, Portland, Oregon, and New York City. In Tomeo, Texas, hundreds of protesters marched Wednesday toward the new immigration detention tent city for children before they were turned around by a rancher who brandished a pistol. This is Stephanie de la Cruz, a protester from Austin, Texas.
I think it's disgusting. I think it's inhumane. I mean, now they're saying that they're going to be able to hold them indefinitely. A kid is going to grow up in a detention camp. That's inhumane. I couldn't say anything. I'm undocumented myself, and when I crossed the border with my family, I spent a day without my mother, and it felt like the longest time of my life. Now imagine those kids in there.
There are massive protests of direct action that are planned for today all over the country, including right here in Brownsville, Texas. Later in the broadcast, we'll be joined here in Brownsville by immigration lawyer Rochelle Garza and longtime human rights activist Jennifer Harbury. In the Mediterranean, a humanitarian aid ship carrying 230 migrants rescued at sea docked in Malta Wednesday after Italy's newly minted government turned the vessel around. The ship, run by the German charity Lifeline, was the second denied a berth in Italy this month after newly confirmed anti-immigrant Interior Minister Matteo Salvini said rescue ships are no longer welcome in Italy. Malta's government said it was allowing the vessel to dock as a one-time agreement on humanitarian grounds and will launch an investigation into whether to criminally charge the ship's crew. In Nairobi, Kenya, a fire tore through an open-air market overnight, leaving at least 15 people dead and more than 70 others injured. Some of the victims died after inhaling poisonous fumes as they raced to recover their belongings. The cause of the blaze is under investigation. Kenya's government hasn't ruled out a possible arson attack. Back in the United States, prosecutors in Pennsylvania have charged East Pittsburgh police officer Michael Rosfeld with criminal homicide for fatally shooting Antoine Rose, a 17-year-old unarmed African-American high school student. Video of the June 19th shooting shows Rosfeld shot Rose in the back while the teenager was trying to flee a traffic stop. Officer Rosfeld had been sworn in to the city's police department just 3 hours before he shot Rose dead. The woman who filmed Antoine's killing said it looked like Officer Rosfeld was taking target practice on this young man's back. This is Allegheny County District Attorney Stephen Zappala.
I find that Rosfeld's actions were intentional, and they certainly brought about the result that he was looking to accomplish.
Zappala said he'd ask a jury to consider first-degree murder charges against Rosfeld, though the charge of criminal homicide opens the door for a possible conviction on lesser charges, including involuntary manslaughter. Rosfeld surrendered to authorities Wednesday morning and was released after posting $250,000 bail. And the Justice Department has approved Disney's $71 billion proposed purchase of most of 21st Century Fox's assets, clearing the way for one of the largest media mergers in history. This comes as Comcast is reportedly considering sweetening its bid to purchase Fox assets after it recently offered $65 billion before Disney responded with a larger counteroffer. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. We're broadcasting live from Brownsville, Texas, on the U.S.-Mexico border. In a move that could transform the Supreme Court for decades, Justice Anthony Kennedy has announced his retirement, giving President Trump a chance to pick a second conservative on the high court. Kennedy, who was nominated by President Reagan, was widely seen as the swing vote on the 9-justice court. On Wednesday, he sided with the conservative wing of the court to deal a major blow to public sector unions in the case of Janus v. AFSCME. He also sided this week with the majority upholding President Trump's Muslim travel ban. In 2010, Justice Kennedy wrote the majority opinion in the landmark Citizens United case, which opened the floodgates for unlimited corporate spending on election campaigns. 3 years later, he voted with the majority to gut the Voting Rights Act. But Kennedy has sided with the liberal wing of the court on a number of pivotal issues. He's been instrumental in preventing Roe v. Wade from being overturned. And he's supported same-sex marriage, affirmative action, criminal justice reform as well. He also ruled on behalf of prisoners at Guantanamo seeking the right to habeas review. On Wednesday, President Trump said he wants to pick a justice who will be on the court for the next 40 to 45 years.
And Justice Kennedy is a star, and we appreciate it. We really have to take our hats off to Justice Kennedy. Thank you very much. Remember this, so we have a pick to come up. We have to pick a great one. We have to pick one that's going to be there for 40 years, 45 years. We need intellect. We need so many things to go. You know, there's so many elements go into the making of a great justice of the Supreme Court. You got to hit every one of them.
Senate Democrats lack enough votes to block Trump's pick, but are pushing for the confirmation process to occur after the midterm elections, just over 4 months away. But Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell has rejected that idea, even though in 2016 he refused to hold hearings in an election year for then-President Barack Obama's Supreme Court nominee Merrick Garland. McConnell's decision allowed Republicans to essentially steal a seat on the Supreme Court. Instead of a liberal justice picked by Obama, the court now has ultra-conservative Justice Neil Gorsuch. On Wednesday, Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer said it would be the height of hypocrisy for the Senate to vote before the midterm elections. He also called for the rejection of any nominee who would overturn Roe v. Wade.
Republicans and President Trump nominate and vote for someone who will preserve protections for people with pre-existing conditions? Or will they support a justice who will put health insurance companies over patients or put the federal government between a woman and her doctor? The Senate should reject, on a bipartisan basis, any justice who would overturn Roe v. Wade or undermine key health care protections. The Senate should reject anyone who will instinctively side with powerful special interests over the interests of average Americans.
We're joined right now from Toronto, Canada, by Dahlia Lithwick, senior editor at Slate.com. She's a senior legal correspondent and Supreme Court reporter. Dahlia also hosts the podcast Amicus. Her latest piece is headlined, "Why Anthony Kennedy Gave Up." Dahlia Lithwick, welcome back to Democracy Now! Talk about your surprise yesterday, and why do you see it as Justice Kennedy giving up?
Well, Amy, first of all, thanks for having me back. I see it as giving up because I was one of an enormous number of people who believed that Anthony Kennedy had certain foundational principles that would make him hesitant to step down when Donald Trump was likely to appoint his successor. For one thing, as you said, he was the bulwark in so many 5-4 cases: reproductive rights, LGBTQ rights, prisoner rights, affirmative action. In so many areas, he was the fifth vote that would have precluded a sea change from overtaking the country. And the idea that his legacy wouldn't matter in considering whether he'd step down, I just didn't see it happening. I thought he would stay on because his legacy was that important. More importantly, he has been the one for 20 years that I've been covering the court who has talked most pointedly about civility, about decorum, about respect, about the dignity of every person. And so to me, the idea that Donald Trump, who's been such a bully, such a xenophobe, such a misogynist, it seemed anathema that Anthony Kennedy could allow somebody like that, who's so polluted the political discourse, to also pollute the judicial discourse. And so I think I was surprised. I knew he was 81. I knew he'd been making noises about wanting to step down, but it just seemed to me that he, more than anyone, was the voice of centrism, moderation, kind of careful respect of dignitary interests, and all that is sort of not how Trump rolls.
And so talk about the significance right now. I mean, Trump famously said, you know, he said, pro-life. He's against abortion. So let's talk about the issue of abortion and what this could mean in this country.
I don't think there's any way to overstate what is about to happen. And I think that there is no doubt in my mind Donald Trump has a list of 25 nominees that he is going to pick from. He published the list in November of 2017. He has pledged that every single one of those people is gunning for Roe v. Wade. I have no reason to doubt that that's true if you look at the list. So I think it is fair to say that the person who was the only vote on the U.S. Supreme Court in the last couple of years to uphold the core principles of Roe and Casey is going to be replaced by someone who wants to overturn Roe. I don't think there's any question that in the next couple of years, the right to choose in this country is going to be gone. How that happens, whether the Supreme Court does it the way they did it yesterday when they simply, with the stroke of a pen, overruled a case in the agency fee case. They overruled a 40-year-old precedent with the stroke of a pen. They could do it that way, or they could chip away at Roe over the coming years, saying things are not undue burdens when they are. But either way you slice it, I think that it is absolutely the case that we are looking at the end of Roe v. Wade in America in the coming years. And by the way, that was Donald Trump's promise. That was why people voted for him. So all he has done is fulfilled on a pledge that focused the electorate, that cared about the court, and forced them to vote for him.
You know, can you explain what it would mean if Roe v. Wade were overturned? And I'm sitting here talking to you on the Texas-Mexico border. You're in Canada. But it was here that Roe v. Wade got its start, right, with Norma McCorvey, who was Jane Doe at the time.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there has been a question that has animated Republican politics since the 70s, since Roe, that has really laser focused on the idea that Roe was the original sin in judicial politics. And you'll remember that Sandra Day O'Connor's confirmation hearing, Anthony Kennedy's confirmation hearing, Ruth Bader Ginsburg's hearing, the issue that matters most to conservative movement Republicans has been doing away with Roe. And that was, again, we had never had until this election in 2016, a president who said, I am promising you a litmus test. The litmus test is that Roe will be gone. Here are my 25 people I'll put up. So he, in effect, promised that Roe will be gone. What it will mean for practical purposes depends on how the court does it. There are already 7 states that have only one abortion provider in the state. We've seen state legislatures and state courts chipping away at Roe for the past decades. So what it's going to mean is that for so many women in this country, many of whom already have to drive for a day to find a provider, many of whom have 72-hour waiting periods, many of whom can't get medication abortions. Already throughout this country in so many states, the ability to procure not just abortion, Amy, but contraception has been under assault for the past decades. What it's going to mean is that that is going to accelerate, and that in states in which the determination has been made, it's been made.
So explain again, how many states, if Roe v. Wade was overturned, already have these anti-abortion laws on the books?
Well, I mean, the number of states, I can't remember offhand how many states. There are states that even have, I believe it's 12, what are called trigger laws that say the minute the Supreme Court overturns Roe, the entire statutory system in that state will revert to pre-Roe. So there are states that have been teeing up to do away with any abortion protection. But I think it's fair to say that in all the states, if you aggregate the number of states that have waiting periods, that have, you know, bans that are earlier and earlier and earlier, that make medication abortions impossible, that have mandatory scripts that warn women that there's a connection between breast cancer and abortion. If you aggregate all the states that have used trap laws and whatever means to make it harder for women to get abortions, whatever protections existed in those states for those women will go away. They'll be gone.
So, I mean, I think we're talking about in the range of something like 33 states. I want to go to then-candidate Donald Trump during a 2016 presidential debate when he was questioned about his views on abortion by moderator Chris Wallace of Fox. We also hear from then Democratic presidential candidate Hillary Clinton.
What I'm asking you, sir, is do you want to see the court overturn? You've just said you want to see the court protect the Second Amendment. Do you want to see the court overturn Roe v. Wade?
Well, if we put another 2 or perhaps 3 justices on, that's really what's going to be, will happen. And that'll happen automatically, in my opinion, because I am putting pro-life justices on the court. I will say this, it will go back to the states, and the states will then make a determination.
I do not think the United States government should be stepping in and making those most personal of decisions. So you can regulate if you are doing so with the life and the health of the mother taken into account.
Mr. Trump, your reaction, and particularly on this issue of late-term partial birth
Well,
abortion.
I think it's terrible. If you go with what Hillary is saying, in the 9th month, you can take the baby and rip the baby out of the womb of the mother just prior to the birth of the baby.
That was Donald Trump in a debate with Hillary Clinton, Dahlia Lithwick. And now President Trump will shape the U.S. Supreme Court if the Republicans get their way in the Senate and are able to confirm a second Trump, extremely conservative Supreme Court justice. And I'm wondering if you could just say a few of the names that are on the list that Trump has already put out. Now, again, it's going to be on the younger end because he says he wants this justice to be there for 40 to 45 years.
Some of the names on the list, I think probably the front runner we're hearing about right now is Brett Kavanaugh, who's on the D.C. Circuit. He's, I think, in his early 50s. Amy Coney Barrett on the 7th Circuit. She is not yet 50. Judge Diane Sykes. There's been a list of, as I said, the youngest one on the list of 25, Amy, is 37 years old. A lot of these folks have not even been judges for very long. Amy Coney Barrett's only been on the 8th Circuit for a few months. But I think that the idea will be to pick someone who is as young as possible. And some of these judges, I think I should add, when they were asked at their confirmation hearings whether Roe was settled precedent, that was a standard answer. Even John Roberts, even Sam Alito were able to say, of course, that was settled law. Some of these younger judges that have been put on the bench in the Trump era are not even willing to say that. And some of those folks are on the short list, too.
Can you talk about what just took place yesterday, Dahlia Lithwick? And that was the Janus decision. Explain exactly what it means.
Right. This is a 40-year-old precedent. There was a case that came before the court called Abood. And what it said is that it was a member of a public sector union. He didn't want to pay what's called agency fees. Those are the fees that you pay in to your union, not to do political work, but simply to do collective bargaining. And the Supreme Court, in a unanimous decision in Abood, said, you know what, that's not compelled speech. That is if you were paying your money in to do political work, that's compelled speech. That violates the First Amendment. But for agency fees to go to simply collective bargaining, that's in the best interest of what they called labor stability. It was in the best interest of the union, and it solved what's called the free rider problem, the notion that people would benefit from collective bargaining without paying in. That was settled precedent. Sam Alito came onto the court a few years ago and started gunning for Abood and saying, no, I don't think that distinction should exist between money paid in for collective bargaining and money paid in for political speech. It's all a violation of the First Amendment. The Supreme Court had resisted overruling Abood outright. Yesterday, in the Janus case, they said no. Money paid in, even if it's just for collective bargaining, violates the fundamental First Amendment rights of union members who don't want to be compelled to speak in that way. And it seems so technical, Amy, but the net aggregate effect will literally be to defund public sector unions. It will be to take millions in dollars out of the coffers of unions. Nobody is going to want to pay in money for agency fees if they don't have to, nor does it in fact seem rational anymore. And what it will mean is eviscerating the power of public sector unions. And I think if you look at that in tandem with the devastating voting rights cases that came down this year, the two gerrymander cases the court failed to address, the Ohio voter purge, which they've blessed, the racial gerrymandering case that just came down that they've blessed. This is really part of an effort to dismantle the Democratic Party, to dismantle voting. It's not just about worker protections. It's partly about worker protections, which the court has been assailing for years. But it's also part of just taking away the power of Democrats to organize and speak and vote. So it will be, I think, one of the most consequential cases of this term, maybe even more so than the travel ban in terms of disempowering labor in this country going forward.
I mean, and of course, Kennedy sided, he sided with the conservative majority on the travel ban. He sided with the conservative majority on Janus. And so there are key issues where, especially the latest ones, where he was already with the extremely, I don't even know if you call it conservative, right-wing Supreme Court now.
Amy, I've been citing a study from about 2008 that was done by Richard Posner of the Seventh Circuit about who were the most conservative judges that have been on the U.S. Supreme Court since FDR. In the last 100 years, 4 of them are sitting on the present court, 4 of the most conservative judges. And Anthony Kennedy was number 10 on that list. So I think it was always a misnomer to believe that he was a centrist or he was a pragmatist, that he was in the middle. He was always a rock-ribbed Republican justice who, on occasion, in the areas you've flagged, for reproductive rights, for gay rights, for affirmative action, sometimes defected. But I think that progressives like the idea that we had a centrist judge who was in play. But in so many of these issues, he was not in play. He voted in Shelby County to strike down the Voting Rights Act. He voted in Heller to uphold gun rights. So I think that it was a little bit of a fantasy that helped liberals feel that all was not lost. But his voting record this term in every one of the closely decided 5-4 cases, conservatives versus liberals, he voted with the conservatives this term. And so I think he ended his career in some way as he started it, as a staunch Republican who was not moving toward the center. And maybe that's easier to say goodbye under those set of facts.
And Dahlia, finally, is the Senate confirming new Supreme Court justice a done deal? I mean, there's a battle going on right now, right? You have Schumer saying, how dare you? You wouldn't confirm Merrick Garland in an election year. And Mitch McConnell saying he's going to move forward. This will be confirmed by the fall. And do people outside of Congress right now have a say in what takes place. I mean, after all, when Trump became the president and both houses of Congress were Republican, it was believed Obamacare was over then, and it never actually happened. It was gutted to a certain extent, but it didn't ultimately happen the way they said it would.
This is the exact inverse of what we saw happened after Antonin Scalia died in February of 2015, 2016, sorry, which is that it was not a question of law or norms. It was a question of power. Mitch McConnell, Paul Ryan said, we are simply not going to let anyone sit in this seat however long it takes. By the time the November election rolled around, people like John McCain and Ted Cruz were running on the promise that they would hold that seat open for 8 years if they could. As long as they controlled the Senate, no one was going to sit in that seat unless a Republican won the election. This is the flip of that. Now we have a situation where, of course, it's a complete rank hypocrisy to say, oh, we can, of course, appoint someone right before an election because we're Republicans. But understand this is about power and the shattering of norms and the violation of, you know, centuries of Senate precedent. But is there anything to stop them? Unless people are really determined to call their senators and say, no, this can't happen, then this is the power they have arrogated to themselves.
If Republicans like Murkowski, like Collins, who consider themselves pro-choice Republicans, side with the Democrats and do vote, but vote against.
If the Republicans who have strongly come out and said, I am pro-choice, are tagged with the possibility that they are going to seat a 45 or 46-year-old justice who will overturn Roe v. Wade, that may be an issue that will really force them to reckon with what they're about to do. But I have to say, counting on Republicans in the Senate to vote against Trump judges, especially judges on this list who are more or less mainstream judges who just plan to do away with abortion rights, I don't know that I would hitch my star to that wagon. But something's got to change. Someone's going to have to take this seriously, because I don't think progressives took it seriously in 2016 when Merrick Garland was being denied a vote.
Well, I want to thank you very much, Dahlia Lithwick, senior editor at Slate.com, senior legal correspondent, Supreme Court reporter. Dahlia also hosts the podcast Amicus. Her latest piece we will link to. It's headlined, Why Anthony Kennedy Gave Up. When we come back, we'll speak with an immigration lawyer based right here in Brownsville, Texas, on the border, who's representing families who've been separated by the Trump administration's zero-tolerance policy. Stay with us.
Señor presidente, le vengo a avisar, no tengo papeles para trabajar. Presidente, pregunto por qué matan al moreno con piel de café. Si fuera presidente, honestamente, si fuera presidente, para mi gente, si fuera presidente, honestamente, presidente, para mi gente.
Check, 1, 2. You see, if I was president, I'd roll up my sleeves as I face the congregation. First thing I do is free education, and every third period we practice meditation. Every third period we practice meditation like a brown Robin Hood. I'd take from the rich and I'd give to the poor, so my little sister ain't gotta be hungry no more. And my first lady would be my mom, cause she smacked me at the first out of drone strikes and dropping bombs. And I'd free all my poor black and brown kids that got caught up in 3 strikes. And when they get out, they getting free bikes, so they could ride to the future, not to their past. Go to the store, get some chips with no GMO, cause my folks, we got a right to know. And if you don't know, now you know. Me gusta la lima, me gusta limón, pero no me gusta tanta corrupción. Me gusta la lima, me gusta limón, pero no me gusta tanta corrupción.
Si fuera presidente, para mi gente, si fuera presidente, honestamente, presidente, para mi gente.
At my inauguration, I burned tobacco at the opening. Send thanks and prayers to Creator and our living beings then. I'd sit you down with your abuelita, rewrite history so our kids could see where we came from and a new destiny. From Flint to Cali, water flowing pure and free. My Department of Peace will melt guns into bike racks. Budget cuts to corporate kickbacks. If I was president, well, there'd still be drama. Takes a village, stickula, generational trauma. So shake your spine, put your hands up high. We got a different kind of party in the White House tonight. If I was president, hey, what would I do if I was president? Hey, I'd ask you if you were president. Hey, what would you do if it was you or you? Me gusta la lima, me gusta limón, pero no me gusta tanta corrupción. Gusta la lima, me gusta limón, pero no me gusta tanta corrupción. My people, it's 2017. We can't wait on no president, no governor, no city council to make it for us.
If I Was President by Las Cafeteras, performing in Democracy Now! Studios. Yes, this is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. We're broadcasting live from Brownsville, Texas, in the Rio Grande Valley, the epicenter of the Trump administration's zero-tolerance crackdown against immigrants. Hours from now, more than 1,000 people from across Texas are expected to converge right here in front of the federal courthouse just behind us. In fact, right behind me, Families Belong Together rally is the stage is being constructed to demand the Trump administration comply with a federal judge's ruling that all migrant children separated from their parents must be reunited within 30 days. Kids under 10, 14 days must be reunited. On Tuesday, federal judge Dana Sabra in San Diego ruled all children under the age of 5, must be reunited within 14 days. And all children 5 and older must be reunited with their parents within 30 days. Health and Human Services Secretary Alex Azar testified in a Senate Finance Committee hearing on Tuesday that 2,047 migrant children remain separated from their parents. He also claimed he could easily locate any one of the kids.
There is no reason why any parent would not know where their child is located. I could, at keystrokes, I've sat on the ORR portal with just basic keystrokes within seconds, could find any child in our care for any parent.
But immigrant parents and their lawyers are telling a very different story. In an interview Wednesday night, attorney Efren Olivares of the Texas Civil Rights Project, here when we went to McAllen to speak to him, described how officials have been keeping track of the families that they separated.
The Border Patrol agents take a family picture, a picture of the family unit, they call it. So a picture of the child and the parent to then keep track of who belongs with who. If that is the system, it's full of problems. It's highly fallible. Forget the problems with cross-racial identification. Just forget about that. Just taking a picture of a 5-year-old and then trying to match him or her with his mom, it's going to be a disaster.
So let's go right now to Rochelle Garza. She's an immigration lawyer based here in Brownsville, Texas, who is representing immigrant families who've been separated by the Trump administration's zero-tolerance policy. Last year, she also represented the 17-year-old immigrant known as Jane Doe, who had to sue the ORR, that's the Office of Refugee Resettlement, for the right to have an abortion while she was jailed in an immigration detention center here in Brownsville. In a ruling this month, the U.S. Supreme Court refused to consider disciplinary action against Jane Doe's attorneys, including Rochelle Garza, in a case brought by the Department of Justice. We welcome Rochelle to Democracy Now! So talk about what is happening. More than 2,000 children are separated. You represent parents. Are they able to speak to their kids?
Well, thank you for having me.
And their kids.
No. Right now, the family that I represent has been unable to have any contact with each other. The system for navigating, locating a child is incredibly difficult. There is a hotline number that has been given out by the Office of Refugee Resettlement. However, anytime you call that hotline number, all they can tell you is, yes, we know that the child is in detention. We can confirm that, but we cannot give you the information as to the exact location of that child.
So what happens then?
So
you're saying Alex Azar is simply not telling the truth.
Well, he's at least not sharing the information with advocates, attorneys that are representing families in trying to reunite them.
So what happens? Explain, when you have a parent, what do they do?
So
in a detention center, perhaps right here in Brownsville.
I mean, I can speak to my client. I mean, he's currently detained, and I've been looking for his daughter, or trying to locate his daughter in the ORR system since early June. There's a hotline number. You call the hotline number, you give the information for the parent and for the child, and all they can do is say, we can put in a request to the facility holding the child to contact you. And this has been going on for weeks.
And how old is the child that your client is trying to reach? His child?
She's 12 years old.
And where is she?
Well, the government has not helped me with that information.
She could be anywhere in the United States?
I did get lucky, full disclosure, I did get lucky, and the first person that I did speak with did confirm she was in the state of Texas. So at least I have that information and have been able to work off of that.
So we're talking about 2,000 cases like this?
Yes. And the issue is that when zero tolerance was implemented, there wasn't a lot of transparency. On the ground level, lawyers, organizations were scrambling to track the families that were being affected. So all of a sudden, we just heard that there was a massive influx of children into the facilities located in South Texas, and then started seeing mass prosecutions in the federal court system. So 40 to 70 people in the morning and in the afternoon being prosecuted for improper entry in federal court. And so from there, advocates have been trying to create a system for, one, identifying the parents that have been prosecuted under 1325 for improper entry, and then trying to talk to them and see if we can locate their children.
Talk about Casa Padre right here in Brownsville. What is it?
Casa Padre is an ORR-funded facility. It is run by Southwest Key, and it currently has the capacity for 1,500 children. As I understand it, the recent number of children that are in there are, around 1,400, and they're mostly boys, teenage boys, that are housed in that facility.
And have you gotten any sense of things being different since President Trump said they are since he issued the executive order rescinding the policy of separating the children?
Well, I mean, no. So he he ordered that the separations would cease, but he didn't speak to the actual prosecutions of individuals. So what it looks like, or what we're trying to figure out what's happening, is are families being put into detention as a whole and the parents being prosecuted. So it's been, you know, one thing after another. A lot of changes have been happening, and on the ground it's difficult to see what's happening until it's already happened.
So what does this San Diego federal judge ruling mean when she said, in the next 14 days, every kid under the age of 5 of these 2,000, more than 2,000 kids, must be reunited with their parent, and in 30 days, all the kids must be?
I mean, it's a good step. It's a good step forward to reuniting the families. I don't know. Logistically, it doesn't really make sense. Like, for my client, he's still currently detained. He's in immigration detention. We're hearing that they want to set up some sort of family reunification at Port Isabel Detention Center, which is not far from Brownsville. It's about a 40-minute drive. I don't know what that looks like. And my concern is, if you put families in that area, if you put them together in that detention facility, one, Port Isabel Detention Center is not equipped to handle children. And and as I understand it, it is already at capacity. And two, if you're going to put all these families together there, you're suspending the due process rights of the children themselves. And you're also violating the Flores Agreement. You can't have them detained for more than 20 days. This is assuming that the children don't have an asylum claim or a special immigrant juvenile visa or any other sort of legal relief of their own, separate of their parents.
And we're going to talk about political asylum in a moment with Jennifer Harbury. I wanted to go back to Jane Doe. Jane Doe, who in the immigration facility, one of your clients, ended up being able to have an abortion, even though the head of ORR, the Office of Refugee Resettlement, Scott Lloyd, was personally determined to prevent her. He came down to Texas. He is the head of this entire Office of Refugee Resettlement, but his main issue in his life has nothing to do with refugees or experience in dealing with refugees. It's just anti-abortion activism.
Yeah, and we received an incredible amount of pushback from him. And the Jane Doe case was, you know, a really hard-fought one, and she was incredibly determined to get the procedure that she wanted. And we were able to make that, we were able to accomplish that for her. But there were a lot of other Jane Does that came forward after our Jane Doe 1.
Is there anything else you'd like to say, not only to the people of this country? We were broadcast on 1,400 public television radio stations around the world, about what's happening here right now, about what's happening behind us as they're constructing the stage for the protest outside the federal courthouse that you know so well. In fact, during the broadcast, I saw a bus go by, one of the buses that carry prisoners.
Well, there's a lot going on down here, and there are a lot of activists and community leaders that are working against some of these issues, or working to stop the administration's policies. There are, as I understand, there's about 3,000 children currently in detention in the ORR-funded facilities. One of my concerns are the tender age children, and I know that there's been reporting on that.
Tender age being under the age of
12. And Jane Doe, and a lot of people don't know this, but Jane Doe was detained in a facility that lost their contract later on from ORR, and that facility specialized in tender age, in taking care of tender age children and setting them up with foster families, so that the least restrictive means of detaining these children. And now my question is, where are those children?
Well, we will leave it there. Where are those children? Rochelle Garza, thank you so much for being with us. Of course, we'll continue to follow this issue as we broadcast from the Texas-Mexico border. We're in Brownsville, Texas. We're going to speak to Jennifer Harbury, the well-known human rights activist and attorney, next. Stay with us.
Thank you.
Sin ocupación, pagada por el mundo, sin ton ni son. Un día me entró la angustia de talonear y al maíz de las hamburguesas vine a dar. Ahora ando indocumentado. Estoy taloneando acá en el Gabo. Me vine de espalda mojada. Pero la neta me ha ido de la patada. He conocido a 2, 3 cuates que les ha ido muy bien. Que tienen hasta coches y les llueven los billetes. Pero yo ya la hice de todo acá en este país. Y para colmo de males no mastico el inglés. Y aquí ando de indocumentado. Estoy taloneando acá en el Gabo. Y aunque ya no uso mis guaraches, aquí aprendí a amar a Dios en tierra apache. Tengo que aprender a hablar el inglés. No tengo a dónde ir, no tengo a quién querer. Me vine de ilegal, pero me dio muy mal.
The Undocumented by El Tree here on Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. We're broadcasting from Brownsville, Texas, ahead of a mass protest later today at the federal courthouse that's right behind us, that's calling on the Trump administration to end the zero-tolerance policy, which has separated more than 2,000 children from their parents who've been charged with a crime for crossing the border. In a minute, we'll be joined by the person who helped draw attention to this crisis when she shared audio with ProPublica of some of the disappeared children in a CBP, Customs and Border Protection facility. The children are estimated to be between the ages of 4 and 10 and can be heard crying, "Mommy, Papi." This is an excerpt, a warning. The audio is disturbing.
No, papá. Cuando saquen la comida. Ay, no, papá. Que me venga, papá. Yo cuando esté allá. Ya le voy a meter a comer. Papá. Si tiene una celda, me la da, por favor.
The person who made that recording asked not to be identified for fear of retaliation, and they were able to share it with the help of our next guest, Jennifer Harbury, who is a human rights lawyer, well-known activist. She has lived here in the Rio Grande Valley for over 40 years, has been active in the response to the zero-tolerance policy. Her husband, Efrain Bamaca Velasquez, was a Mayan comandante guerrilla in the highlands of Guatemala. He was disappeared after he was captured by the army in the 1980s after a long campaign that she found here was U.S. involvement in the cover-up of her husband's murder and torture. We will talk about this in the show and a post-show, which we'll post online. And she works with people who are fleeing violence from Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras, and come here to the United States for political asylum. For more, Jennifer, it's great to have you with us. Political asylum, this issue, how important it is right now. What are people missing when they understand what's happening here?
Well, there are, of course, two categories of people trying to come into the United States, and Trump is blending them together. One category would be cartel people. They have enough money to buy an airport and a jumbo jet and as many passports and visas as they want. We're not going to be watching them swimming the river. The most important category are the refugees, and they're fleeing this ungodly world of violence and exploitation that's being set up by the cartels all through Central America and for most of Mexico. We also have many people coming in from Africa who are fleeing genocide against their ethnic minority, or, for example, a young man from Ghana who is gay and was nearly killed by a vigilante mob and who was nearly deported last week.
So talk about what is happening in these cases, and in cases you know so well from Latin America, from Central America, Honduras, El Salvador, Guatemala. What is the U.S. role? People say, why should we take in these people, even if their countries are racked by violence? Why is that our responsibility?
Well, number one, it's who all of our parents and grandparents are, of course, right? We came here My father was a refugee at age 11. He came to Ellis Island fleeing World War II. So number one, it's our heritage. But number two, the United States has everything to do with the creation of the monsters that are driving the refugees up to our border. They're fleeing the cartels. Who are the heads of the cartels? Well, after the dirty wars ended that included genocide and daily acts of torture and terror, according to the United Nations, those people changed their uniforms and became the head of the cartel groups. They're extremely wealthy. They have full military experience, which is why a gang of young people are able to pull aside a bus so accurately, and they have unlimited access to all of the weaponry and everything else that they need. Now, who were the people at the head of military intelligence, for example, in Guatemala? Well, those were people who were trained in the United States, worked very closely with the United States intelligence throughout the genocide, and we were, of course, severely criticized for that by the United Nations Truth Commission, and President Clinton apologized. 200,000 people were killed by those death squads. Those of us that survived that era, we remember the sorts of torture and mutilations that the bodies would bear when we found them out in the street, and they're the same as now. So what's happened is the cartel leaders are the same people that worked hand in glove with the United States. They were armed by the United States. They were trained by the United States. They were sold equipment by the United States. And to a large extent, they're still being protected by our intelligence division. They will not release key files on the genocide if it involved someone that used to work with our people. For example, one of my husband's torturers, Colonel Alpirez, was brought to the United States after the disclosures, lived near the CIA with his entire family for nearly 10 years, and when I found out about it, was tipped off, and he fled back to Guatemala. He was trained at the School of the Americas. He directly participated in the genocide, and he was a paid asset of the CIA. That means in return for giving information, he received money from the CIA. He was a paid informant.
And now you have women and children trying to cross over these bridges to apply for political asylum, and they're told there's no room. Is this legal?
No, it's completely illegal. I'll describe very briefly what's happening. You cannot apply for political asylum outside the United States. You have to get here somehow, even if it's just an inch of turf. You can go across the river. Hopefully your child won't drown. You will be caught if you're running with small children, and then you're going to have your kids taken away. How can you go the legal method? You walk across the bridge as provided by statute. You knock on the door of the port of entry and say, hello, I'm here to ask for political asylum. I'm in danger. They must then send you for a credible fear interview. It's not optional. And if you pass your credible fear interview, which most people do, you go into the proceedings before an immigration judge. There's been a huge attack on that since President Trump came into office. In other words, we're shutting down both doors. What happened when Trump came in is they started just turning people away at the bridge, saying, Trump's president, now we don't do that anymore. One of my clients was a woman who had fled traffickers in Guatemala, was in a terrible wreck just before she reached Reynosa, and her daughter was killed, and she was horribly injured. She walked across the bridge on a walker, having just recovered from a broken pelvis at 2 months in the hospital. They turned her away, and at the base of the bridge back in Mexico, she was kidnapped. That stopped for a little while. It's now going on full blast. The second piece of the shutdown for them is if they do get across, which takes quite a battle these days, they're sent to detention centers which operate like terrible prisons. No partitions between the toilet bowls. You can't touch one another even if your cellmate just found out her child was murdered. You cannot receive better food, etc. So we've made it so unbearable, and people are in jail in these jails now for 2 years, 3 years. That's why it's quote unquote full, because we are no longer doing what we legally have to do, which is to release them on parole.
We're going to continue this discussion in part 2, and we'll post online under web exclusives at DemocracyNow.org. Jennifer Harbury, human rights lawyer and activist here in Brownsville as we broadcast from the border. I'm Amy Goodman. Thanks for joining us.